Now, I'll show the difference between two situations that drivers often confuse with each other: when a vehicle actually pulls to one side while you're driving, and when the steering wheel is simply sitting a little off-center, even though the vehicle itself is tracking straight down the road. These two conditions may look similar at first glance, but they are not the same problem, and they can have completely different causes. But before you try to figure any of that out, the very first thing you should do is check the tire pressure. Uneven tire pressure alone can easily make a vehicle pull to one side. Road conditions today are pretty harsh because of the winter weather. There's a lot of snow on the road, so it won't be very easy to clearly evaluate the difference between these two situations. But that's actually part of the point here. I want to show how this works in real winter driving conditions, not on perfectly clean pavement. You can also see several warning lights on the dashboard right now: ABS, the brake system light, stability control, and the message that says Service Advanced Track. In this particular case, those warnings are not related to what we're demonstrating. However, it's worth mentioning that if your steering wheel ends up sitting off-center, for example after a repair, after a wheel alignment, or after hitting a pothole, that alone can sometimes trigger warning lights. The vehicle's systems expect the steering wheel position to match the direction the vehicle is actually traveling. If those two don't match, the system may set a warning. I'm not sure why this truck in front of me has stopped. Out here in the rural areas, people are friendly, but life is simple. It's not unusual to see someone stop right in the road just to talk on the phone. Now, this type of testing really needs to be done on an empty road. So we'll let these vehicles pass first and then start the test. The customer's complaint was that when the steering wheel appears to be straight, the vehicle still pulls to one side. I'm reproducing that situation now. See what happens here? The car clearly moves to the left. Let me show it again for clarity. Here I put the steering wheel straight, and the car goes left again. Customers often describe such a situation in this way: my car pulls to the left. But that description isn't quite correct. In this case, the car isn't actually pulling left. The steering wheel is simply off-center. To check properly, you briefly release the wheel and let it settle naturally. Let's try to find a smoother section on this road. We release the wheel, and yes, it does drift to the left slightly. Although on this road it could be almost anything. Let's try again. Now it goes straight, well, maybe slightly to the left. Let's try to find a better road section. We won't go onto the highway because traffic is too heavy over there for this testing. Let's try this road instead. In the summer, this is actually my favorite test road because it has almost no cross slope, which makes it very good for checking whether a vehicle really pulls to one side. But in winter, it's not cleared very well, so snow buildup on the road itself can make the vehicle drift depending on where the wheels run. Let's try again. Now look, the car is driving more or less straight, but the steering wheel is turned slightly to the right. That's the trend we're seeing here.
Oops.
Driving becomes, should I say, exciting. When the tires are not really good winter tires, the roads are snowy and slippery, and on top of that, ABS and stability control is not working. Going in the opposite way now. You can clearly see that the vehicle itself continues to move straight, or almost straight, while the steering wheel at the same time is slightly turned to the right. This steering wheel centering issue is essentially what we're going to get fixed now. I think the demonstration was clear enough, so we don't really need to keep driving around any longer. As you could see, the car generally goes straight, at least as much as these road conditions allow, but the steering wheel tends to sit slightly off to the right. So, in this case, we're dealing not so much with the vehicle pulling to the left, as the customer described, but simply with the steering wheel sitting off-center. Remember this, that was the steering wheel position when the vehicle was actually driving straight. We've already set the toe alignment within the proper specification. So, at this point, all we need to do is make a small adjustment on both sides, just enough to bring the steering wheel back to a centered position while keeping the alignment within spec. Normally, I do this adjustment right on the road, but in winter that's not something I'm eager to do. Honestly, I'm not thrilled about doing it in the garage either, but what can I do? I hope you can see the two little white marks I made on the tie rods after performing the alignment. This is our baseline position. Now, we'll adjust this tie rod slightly so the steering wheel sits straight when the vehicle is driving forward. To do that, we need to make this tie rod a little longer by turning the adjustment about 120 degrees clockwise. That would be about 2 flats of the hex on this inner tie rod. Notice how now this edge of the hex lines up with the white mark on the outer rod. Now, I'll tighten the nut. Of course, it would be much better to film this kind of video in the summer, when everything is clean, dry, and easy to work on. But the whole idea of this channel is to show how the work is actually done in real life right here, in our far, far away land of the deep, cold Nord. I'm trying very hard right now not to say a few profanities describing how I feel here. Okay, so I've lengthened the tie rod on the left side. Now I need to shorten the right one by exactly the same amount.
Поехали дальше.
Now, let's repeat the driving exercise. Now, we repeat the driving test and try to keep the vehicle going straight as much as the road conditions allow. You can already see that the steering wheel is now pretty close to center. Maybe not quite exactly. I prefer to evaluate this mostly by feel, because when you're driving, you should really be watching the road, not staring at the steering wheel. So I place my hand like this, and sometimes people riding with me wonder why I'm holding my hand that way. The reason is simple. I'm feeling the difference in height between the rim of the steering wheel and the edge of the steering column cover. If that height feels uneven, it means the steering wheel is still slightly off-center. Whenever I park the car in the shop with the keys inside, I always leave the window open. That's a habit developed over many years, for a very good reason. When you accidentally lock the keys inside the car a few times because the central locking suddenly activates, you'll develop the same habit. Guaranteed. The important thing now is not to get confused. This one is the tie rod we are still lengthening by turning it about 60 more degrees clockwise. At my age, you probably see a clearer picture on the screen than what I see here now without my reading glasses. The right tie rod now needs to be shortened by turning it the same 60 degrees, but counterclockwise. I have slightly overdone the adjustment. The steering wheel now is a bit to the left. Personally, I always prefer the steering wheel to be perfectly centered. Why? First of all, simply because it looks better and satisfies my slightly unhealthy sense of perfectionism. I know it may sound like a small detail, but when I sit behind the wheel every day, even a small misalignment becomes constantly irritating for me. I constantly notice it right in front of me. The wheel is turned a little to one side, and my brain keeps perceiving it as a failure, an imperfection. But there is also a technical reason too. Yeah, see? Now it sits a tiny bit to the left. I've overdone just a little compensating the thing. It is a bit to the left now. For the best results, I'd say we should now check what's the actual toe-in we have now, after making all these adjustments, a factual one. Then, depending on which direction the toe setting deviates from the ideal value, we'll make a very small correction. That means either tightening or loosening just one tie rod by 60 degrees. We can do that on either the left side or the right side, depending on which way the alignment needs to move. If the toe setting already turns out to be exactly within the ideal specification, then it really doesn't matter which tie rod we turn by 60 degrees, because such a small adjustment will still remain safely within the specified range. I never quite finished the thought about why I like the steering wheel to sit perfectly centered. More precisely, why it is technically beneficial for the steering wheel to be exactly in the center position. The reason is that it allows you to evaluate the condition of the suspension and steering components almost at any moment while driving. Once you have properly centered the steering wheel, it becomes a very convenient reference point. If later you begin to notice that the wheel is no longer centered when the vehicle is traveling straight, that can tell you something has changed. For example, if the steering wheel suddenly shifts after you hit a pothole, that usually means something in the suspension or steering system may have bent. In other cases, the change may appear gradually as components slowly wear over time. What makes this especially useful is that even a very small amount of wear or a very slight change in the wheel alignment angles often produces a clearly noticeable shift in the steering wheel position. That is the real reason for doing this adjustment, not just because it looks nicer when the wheel is straight. Let me think this through for a moment. The specification was 0.2 degrees. .2 degrees is about 12 minutes of angle, and here we have roughly 13 minutes on the gauge. That's close enough to call it practically ideal, which means it really doesn't matter which tie rod I adjust at this point. Still, let's think about the direction anyway. If I want the toe to be just a little bit smaller, just a tiny bit less, then I need to tighten one of the tie rods slightly. The left one.
Левую.
It is even better now. 12 minutes of angle. Just like I said, barely changed, but it is even more ideal now.
Еще раз проеду.
We're not exceeding the speed limit, at least while the camera is pointed at the speedometer. Now we can say that the steering wheel is centered. I'm not completely sure yet whether the car isn't pulling just a little to the left. It could simply be the condition of the road in this particular spot. Yes, it looks like the road itself is pulling the car to the side here. Now, I'm driving the opposite direction through the same spot, and the car pulls to the right instead. As for the steering wheel, it is now perfectly centered, which was exactly the goal of this whole adjustment process. Now that we're back in the yard, I'll try to show you, as best as I can on camera, what a perfectly centered steering wheel actually looks like. See this lighter strip of reflection between the rim of the steering wheel and the steering column cover? That gap should appear the same width on both sides. When the steering wheel is centered properly, that reflection looks even and symmetrical. From different viewing angles, you can also notice that the edge of the steering wheel and the edge of the airbag line up visually with the edge of the steering column cover. When all of those lines appear even and balanced, that's what a properly centered steering wheel looks like.